Tony Bennett pushed through the heavy glass doors of Rouse, the legendary East Harlem restaurant, where he had been dining for over 40 years. At 97, his evening routine had become sacred. Arrive at 6:30 p.m. sharp, sit at his usual corner table, order the same meal, and enjoy 2 hours of quiet reflection before heading home to Susan. But tonight, something was different. His usual table, table 7, tucked away in the corner, where he could observe the room without being constantly approached by fans, was occupied by a single man in his 60s. Wearing an expensive charcoal gray suit and reading a worn paperback book. The man looked up as Tony approached, and their eyes met for a moment that felt strangely charged with recognition, though Tony was certain he had never seen this person before. "Mr. Bennett," said Frankie, the restaurant's long-serving maitre d', hurrying over with obvious distress. "I'm so sorry, but there was a mix-up with reservations tonight. Your usual table is—" He glanced nervously at the stranger. "It's quite all right," the man said, standing and extending his hand toward Tony with a warm smile. "I was hoping you might join me. I've been admiring your music for decades, and I'd consider it an honor to share a meal with you." Tony hesitated. His routine was important to him, especially as his memory had become less reliable with age. Disruptions to his carefully structured evenings often left him feeling disoriented and anxious. But there was something about the man's demeanor, respectful but not servile, confident but not pushy, that intrigued him. "I suppose that would be fine," Tony said, settling into the chair opposite the stranger. "I'm Tony Bennett, though I suspect you already knew that." "Indeed I did. My name is Michael Torrino, and I've been waiting a very long time for this opportunity to meet you." The name Torrino sent a chill through Tony's body. He had spent years trying to forget his encounters with the Torrino family in the 1960 seconds when Vincent Torrino Sr. had attempted to control his career through a combination of financial pressure and barely veiled threats. But that had been decades ago, and Vincent had been dead for 25 years. "Torrino," Tony said carefully. "Any relation to Vincent Torrino?" Michael smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Vincent was my father, Mr. Bennett, but please, don't let that alarm you. I'm not here to continue any old family business. I'm here to offer you something that I think you'll find irresistible." Tony considered leaving, but his curiosity overcame his caution. What kind of offer? Michael closed his book. Tony could now see it was a biography of Frank Sinatra, and leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Bennett, how would you like to perform one final concert that would be remembered as the greatest performance in the history of American music?" "I'm always interested in great performances," Tony replied warily, "but I'm not sure what you mean by final. I mean a concert that would serve as the ultimate capstone to your career. A performance so perfect, so emotionally powerful, that it would eclipse every other musical event in living memory. A concert that would ensure your legacy as the greatest interpreter of American standards who ever lived." Tony studied Michael's face, trying to read the intention behind the words. "That's a lovely sentiment, Mr. Torrino, but I'm not sure how you could guarantee such a thing. Great performances can't be manufactured." "Ah, but they can be inspired," Michael said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "What if I told you that I could arrange for you to perform for an audience of people who have never heard your music before, people who would experience your voice with fresh ears and open hearts? What if I told you that this audience would be composed entirely of individuals who desperately need what your music can provide? Hope, beauty, connection, healing." Tony felt his interest growing despite his wariness. "What kind of audience are you talking about?" Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside this envelope are photographs and biographical information about 50 people who have never experienced live music of any kind. They are residents of a private care facility for individuals with severe autism and developmental disabilities. Most of them have spent their entire lives unable to connect with other human beings through conventional communication. Tony opened the envelope and found himself looking at photographs of men and women ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, all with faces that conveyed both intelligence and profound isolation. The biographical notes were heartbreaking. Individuals who had spent decades in institutions, who had never formed meaningful relationships, who lived in worlds of silence and confusion despite their families' best efforts to reach them. These people, Michael continued, represent the ultimate musical challenge. They cannot be swayed by reputation or nostalgia or cultural conditioning. If your music reaches them, if it breaks through their isolation and creates connection, it will be because your voice carries something genuinely transcendent. Tony studied the photographs, feeling his heart break for these forgotten people. Why are you showing me this? Because I want to hire you to perform for them. A private concert, just you and a piano, in the common room of their facility. No recording, no publicity, no reviews. Just you and your music, and 50 people who need to hear what you have to offer. And what do you want in return? Michael's expression became serious. I want you to help me understand something about my father. Tony felt the trap beginning to close around him. What about your father? My father spent the last 20 years of his life consumed with regret about how he treated you and other performers in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds. He never said this directly, but I could see it in the way he talked about music, the way he avoided listening to your records, even though he clearly loved them. Michael paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Before he died, my father asked me to make amends to the people he had wronged during his business career. Most of those people are dead now, but you're still alive. I want to do something meaningful in his memory, something that honors both his regret and your talent. Tony was skeptical. You want to pay me to perform for disabled people as a way of apologizing for your father's behavior 40 years ago? I want to create a situation where your music can accomplish what it was meant to accomplish, providing beauty and connection to people who need it most. If that also serves as an apology to you, so much the better. Tony found himself genuinely moved by the proposal, but his experience with the Torrino family had taught him to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true. What's the catch, Mr. Torrino? Michael smiled again, and this time the expression seemed genuine. No catch, Mr. Bennett. I'll pay you $50,000 to perform for 1 hour. The money comes from a trust fund my father established specifically for making amends to people he had wronged. All I ask is that you give these people the best performance you're capable of. Tony studied the photographs again. The faces of the residents seemed to call out to him, reminding him of why he had started singing in the first place. Not for fame or money, but for the simple joy of creating connection through music. When would this concert take place? Tomorrow evening, if you're willing. The facility is about an hour outside the city. I'll arrange transportation, and you can bring anyone you'd like for support. Tony made his decision. I'll do it. Over the next 24 hours, Tony found himself more excited about a performance than he had been in years. He spent the morning selecting songs that he thought might break through the barriers that separated the facility's residents from the world around them. He chose pieces that were melodically simple but emotionally complex. What a Wonderful World, The Way You Look Tonight, Over the Rainbow. Susan was supportive, but worried. Tony, are you sure about this? You don't know anything about this man or his motivations. I know he's giving me a chance to sing for people who really need music, Tony replied. At my age, opportunities like that are precious. The drive to the facility took Tony and Susan through rural New Jersey, past farms and small towns that seemed untouched by time. The Serenity Springs Care Center was a modern, well-maintained building surrounded by gardens and walking paths. It looked more like a retreat center than an institution. Michael met them in the parking lot, accompanied by Dr. Sarah Chen, the facility's director. "Mr. Bennett, thank you so much for coming, Doctor," Chen said. "Our residents have never experienced anything like this. We're not sure how they'll respond, but we're grateful for the opportunity." Tony was led into a large, comfortable room where 50 residents sat in chairs, arranged in a semicircle around a baby grand piano. The ages and conditions of the residents varied dramatically, but they all shared a quality of profound disconnection from their surroundings. Some rocked gently in their chairs, others stared at the ceiling. A few made repetitive hand movements that seemed to comfort them. Tony sat down at the piano and looked out at his unusual audience. These people couldn't applaud, couldn't show appreciation in conventional ways, couldn't provide the feedback that usually energized his performances. He would have to find other ways to measure whether his music was reaching them. He began with "What a Wonderful World," playing the melody softly and singing with a gentleness he had never used in public performance. As his voice filled the room, Tony noticed subtle changes in some of the residents. A woman in her 40s stopped rocking and turned her head toward the piano. A young man who had been staring at the floor slowly raised his eyes. Tony continued with "Over the Rainbow," and the changes became more pronounced. Several residents seemed to be listening intently, their usual patterns of movement slowing or stopping entirely. One elderly man began to move his hands in rhythm with the music, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. But it was during "The Way You Look Tonight" that something extraordinary happened. A woman in her 30s, who had been sitting motionless since Tony arrived, began to hum along with the melody. Her voice was untrained but pure, and her humming added a haunting harmony to Tony's singing that brought tears to his eyes. As Tony finished the song, he noticed that most of the residents were now focused on him in ways that Dr. Chen later said she had never seen before. Their usual self-protective behaviors had given way to something that looked remarkably like musical engagement. Tony performed for exactly 1 hour, as promised, but he could have continued all night. The connection he felt with this audience was unlike anything he had experienced in 7 decades of performing. These people weren't listening to Tony Bennett, the celebrity. They were simply receiving music, pure and unfiltered by expectations or preconceptions. When Tony finished his final song, a gentle version of "Fly Me to the Moon," the room was completely silent. None of the residents applauded, but their attention remained focused on Tony in a way that felt more meaningful than any standing ovation he had ever received. Dr. Chen was crying. "Mr. Bennett, I've worked with these residents for 15 years, and I've never seen them respond to anything the way they responded to your music. You reached them in ways that we've been trying to reach them for decades." As Tony prepared to leave, Michael Torrino approached him with an envelope containing the promised payment. "Mr. Bennett, I hope you'll accept this as a small token of my family's gratitude for what you've accomplished here tonight." Tony looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "Mr. Torrino, I appreciate your gesture, but I can't accept payment for tonight. What happened in that room was a gift to me as much as it was to your residents." Michael seemed surprised. "But we had an agreement." "We did, and I fulfilled my part, but the experience I just had was worth far more than $50,000. Please donate that money to the facility for whatever these residents need most." Michael studied Tony's face, and Tony could see respect growing in the younger man's eyes. "My father would have been amazed by your generosity, Mr. Bennett. He never understood that some things can't be bought or sold. Your father was trying to control something that can't be controlled, Tony replied. Music belongs to everyone, especially to people who need it most. Tonight reminded me of that. As Tony and Susan drove back to the city, Tony felt a profound sense of completion. He had given one of the most important performances of his life to an audience of 50 people who couldn't applaud, couldn't buy his records, couldn't advance his career in any measurable way. "How do you feel?" Susan asked. "I feel like I remembered why I started singing," Tony replied. "Not for fame or money or recognition, but for moments like tonight when music creates connection where none existed before." 3 weeks later, Tony received a letter from Dr. Chen that brought tears to his eyes. The woman who had hummed along with "The Way You Look Tonight" had continued humming since Tony's visit, and her family was hearing her voice for the first time in 30 years. 2 other residents had begun responding to music therapy in ways they never had before. The elderly man who had conducted Tony's music had started eating better and sleeping more peacefully. "Your performance didn't just entertain our residents, Doctor," Chen wrote. "It opened doors in their minds that we didn't even know existed. You gave them access to a form of communication and connection that has improved their quality of life immeasurably." But the most significant letter came from Michael Torrino himself. "Mr. Bennett," the letter began, "I need to confess something about my invitation to perform at Serenity Springs. While everything I told you about wanting to honor my father's memory was true, I had an ulterior motive that I'm now ashamed of. The truth is, I had arranged to record your performance without your knowledge. My plan was to release the recording as a way of reviving interest in my father's entertainment legacy and positioning our family as supporters of charitable causes. I had hidden cameras and recording equipment installed in the common room at Serenity Springs. But watching you perform that night, seeing the genuine connection you created with those residents, witnessing your refusal to accept payment for something you clearly considered a privilege rather than a job, I realized that my plan was not just dishonest, but fundamentally contrary to everything your music represents. I destroyed the recordings without listening to them. What happened that night belongs to you and those 50 residents, not to the commercial music industry or to my family's reputation. You taught me something my father never learned, that the most valuable things in life can't be captured, packaged, or sold. They can only be experienced in the moment they occur by the people fortunate enough to be present. Thank you for reminding me why my father spent his final years regretting the way he had treated artists like you, and thank you for showing me a better way to honor both his memory and your music." Tony never responded to Michael's letter, but he kept it in his desk drawer and read it whenever he needed to remember why he had devoted his life to music. The performance at Serenity Springs had been exactly what Michael had promised, the greatest performance in the history of American music, not because of its technical perfection or commercial success, but because it had accomplished what music was meant to accomplish: creating connection, providing comfort, and reminding everyone present that beauty and love could transcend any barrier. Years later, when music historians asked Tony to identify the most important performance of his career, he would always mention the hour he spent singing to 50 people who couldn't applaud. It was the night he remembered that applause was never the point. The point was the moment when music reached across the silence and touched another human soul, creating connection where none had existed before. The restaurant encounter with Michael Torrino had led to the most meaningful performance of Tony's life, but it had also taught him something equally important. Sometimes the best offers are the ones that ask nothing of you except that you be exactly who you already are, sharing your gifts with people who need them most, expecting nothing in return except the privilege of making music for those who hunger for beauty in a world that often seems devoid of it. But the story didn't end with Michael's confession letter. 3 months after the Serenity Springs performance, Tony received an unexpected phone call that would reveal the true complexity of his encounter with Michael Torrino. "Mr. Bennett, this is Detective Maria Rodriguez from the New Jersey State Police. I'm calling about Michael Torrino and the Serenity Springs Care Center. I need to speak with you about your recent interactions with Mr. Torrino." Tony felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What kind of interactions, Detective?" "Mr. Torrino has been arrested for fraud and embezzlement. We've discovered that he's been using charitable performances like yours as a front for money laundering operations. I need to know if you received any payments from him that might be connected to illegal activities." Tony's mind reeled. "Detective, Mr. Torrino offered me $50,000 for the performance, but I refused to take it. I asked him to donate the money to the facility instead." "That's what we were afraid of, Mr. Bennett. There is no charitable trust fund established by Vincent Torrino Sr. The money Michael offered you came from embezzled funds from several New York arts organizations. By donating it to Serenity Springs, he was essentially laundering stolen money through a legitimate charity." Tony felt sick. "Are you saying the entire performance was part of a criminal scheme?" "Not exactly," Detective Rodriguez replied. "The residents at Serenity Springs are real, and your performance genuinely helped them, Doctor. Chen confirms that everything you experienced that night was authentic, but Michael Torrino used your reputation and the emotional appeal of the story to legitimize what was essentially a money laundering operation. What happens now? We need you to testify about your interactions with Michael Torrino. The case against him includes fraud charges related to the misappropriation of arts funding, and your testimony could be crucial in establishing his pattern of using charitable events to hide criminal activities." Tony spent the next several weeks grappling with the knowledge that his most meaningful performance had been entangled with criminal activity. The purity of his connection with the Serenity Springs residents remained untainted, but the circumstances that had brought him there were revealed to be corrupt. During the trial preparation, Tony learned more disturbing details about Michael Torrino's operations. Michael had been running a sophisticated scheme for 3 years, approaching elderly celebrities and offering them opportunities to perform for charitable causes. He would pay them with embezzled money, then use the charitable donations and the celebrities' participation to create tax write-offs and money laundering opportunities for various criminal enterprises. "Mr. Bennett," explained Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, "you were targeted specifically because of your reputation for integrity and charitable work. Michael knew that your participation would lend credibility to his scheme and make it difficult for investigators to question the legitimacy of the operation." Tony realized that Michael's story about his father's regret had been carefully crafted to manipulate him into participating. The performance at Serenity Springs hadn't been an act of redemption. It had been the centerpiece of an elaborate financial crime. But the most disturbing revelation came when Tony learned about Michael's true relationship to Vincent Torrino Sr. "Mr. Bennett," Detective Rodriguez explained during a pretrial interview, "Michael Torrino is not Vincent Torrino's son. His real name is Michael Chen, and he's the nephew of Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of Serenity Springs. He adopted the Torrino name as part of his scheme to gain credibility with celebrities who had historical connections to the Torrino family." Tony felt betrayed on multiple levels. Not only had Michael lied about his identity and his motivations, but he had exploited Tony's traumatic memories of Vincent Torrino Sr. to manipulate him into participation. "Dr. Chen is also under investigation," the detective continued. "We believe she was aware of her nephew's criminal activities and may have been complicit in using Serenity Springs as a front for money laundering." Tony's heart broke for the residents of Serenity Springs, who had become unwitting participants in a criminal enterprise despite their genuine need for the music and connection he had provided. The trial of Michael Chen, aka Michael Torrino, became a media sensation, partly because of Tony Bennett's involvement and partly because of the scheme's exploitation of both celebrities and disabled individuals. Tony's testimony was emotional and powerful, describing both the genuine beauty of his performance for the residents and his anger at being manipulated into participating in criminal activity. Mr. Chen exploited my desire to help vulnerable people, Tony testified. He used my music and my reputation to legitimize criminal activity, and in doing so, he violated everything I believe about the purpose of music and the responsibility of artists to serve their communities honestly. Michael Chen was ultimately convicted on 15 counts of fraud and embezzlement and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Dr. Sarah Chen received a suspended sentence and was banned from working in healthcare after it was determined that her participation had been limited and that she had genuinely believed she was helping her nephew establish a legitimate, charitable program. But the most important outcome of the trial was the establishment of the Bennett Foundation for Music Therapy, which Tony created using his own money to ensure that the residents of Serenity Springs and similar facilities would continue to receive music therapy services despite the scandal that had engulfed their previous program. What happened at Serenity Springs taught me that good intentions and genuine connection can exist even within corrupt circumstances, Tony said at the Foundation's launch event. The residents who hummed along with my music, who found comfort and communication through songs, were not part of any criminal scheme. They were simply human beings who needed beauty and connection, and they taught me that music's power to heal transcends the motives of the people who arrange performances. Tony continued to visit Serenity Springs monthly for the rest of his life, always bringing his piano and always spending time with the residents whose response to his music had reminded him of why he became a performer in the first place. The woman who had hummed along with "The Way You Look Tonight" during his first visit became a regular singing partner, and their duets became legendary among the staff and families connected to the facility. She's never spoken a word to her family, Dr. Chen's replacement, Dr. James Morrison, told Tony during one visit, but she sings with you as if you've been musical partners for decades. You've given her a voice she never knew she had. The experience with Michael Chen had taught Tony important lessons about trust, manipulation, and the exploitation of charitable impulses. But it had also reinforced his belief that music's power to create connection and provide healing was independent of the circumstances surrounding any individual performance. I was manipulated into giving that first performance at Serenity Springs, Tony reflected in an interview years later. But the music itself was never manipulated. The connection I felt with those residents was real. Their response to the songs was genuine. And the healing that occurred happened because music transcends the intentions of the people who arrange concerts or the motivations of those who provide funding. Tony's monthly performances at Serenity Springs became some of the most important work of his final years. He developed a special repertoire of songs that consistently reached the residents, and he worked with music therapists to understand how his performances could be most beneficial for people with autism and developmental disabilities. The residents became his teachers, showing him new ways to interpret familiar songs and demonstrating that musical communication could exist without words, without conventional feedback. They taught me to listen differently, Tony said. When you perform for people who can't applaud, you have to find other ways to measure whether your music is working. You listen for changes in breathing, shifts in posture, for the moment when someone's movements align with your rhythm. The Bennett Foundation eventually expanded to serve dozens of facilities, but Tony always returned to Serenity Springs, where he had learned that his most meaningful audiences might be the ones who couldn't tell him how much his music meant to them. On Tony's 100th birthday, the residents presented him with a recording of themselves humming his most beloved songs. Their untrained but pure voices created harmonies no professional chorus could achieve. "This is what music is supposed to sound like," Tony said. "Not perfect, but honest. Not technically flawless, but emotionally true." The restaurant encounter that had begun with deception had ultimately led to Tony's most important discovery, that his greatest performances were not measured by applause or reviews, but by moments of genuine connection with people who needed music most, people who taught him that singing was about creating bridges between isolated souls and reminding everyone that they were not alone. Michael Chen's scheme had been designed to exploit Tony's charitable impulses, but it inadvertently led to a musical legacy that would outlive any recording. The knowledge that music's greatest power lies in its capacity to heal, connect, and remind both performers and listeners that beauty can exist even in darkness, waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to listen with an open heart.